Good morning, everyone, and everyone listening in throughout the complex and from elsewhere. As you know, shortly after I was appointed as Deputy Director, I asked Admiral Dave Jeremiah to convene a panel to take a careful look at the future of the National Reconnaissance Office in several dimensions. Our mission in the future and whether or not it needed to be adjusted or changed in any way. The way in which we interact with our customers, can we be more effective in that? Who are our customers? Are we dealing with them in a manner which promotes the best that we can do? I asked them to look at business processes within the NRO. Are they effective? Can they be improved? The organizational structure of the organization. Now that the organization was coming together physically at one location in Westfields, were there ideas and imperatives that suggest that we should adjust that organizational structure? The relationships that we have with the very important relationships that we have with the Central Intelligence Agency and the Air Force and the Navy and so forth, were there any adjustments that needed to be made in that? The panel labored long and hard. I told Admiral Jeremiah that I thought this would probably entail a few meetings of a few hours each to come in and hear the results from various panels. It turned out to be much more work than that. But they labored long and hard. It involved many of you throughout the organization participating in it, as well as those from other government agencies and from the industrial community. The panel has completed its effort. They provided a briefing last week to the DCI and the Secretary of Defense, who heard the recommendations that the panel had, took them on board, were enthusiastic about it. They're in the final stages of preparing their report, which hopefully will be available sometime in the next week or so. And I have asked my senior managers throughout the organization to consider the recommendations of the panel, and on August 1st, they will be coming in for a Program Managers Quarterly Forum, and it would be my intent to go through each and every one of the recommendations that Admiral Jeremiah and his panel has provided to us and propose and come up with an action plan that I can bring to the DCI and the Secretary of the Defense no later than August 15th. This is an important event for the organization. I want to make sure that everyone is apprised of the recommendations that are in the report and the basis for those recommendations, and have an opportunity to comment through the chain of command as we formulate this implementation plan over the course of the next several weeks. In that regard, we scheduled today for the briefing that Mr. Munson will give you on the overall summary of the plan, and we'll be putting out copies of the final report for all of you to see on the next. Admiral Jeremiah very graciously agreed to come in and provide some introductory remarks before Mr. Munson gets on with the briefing on the results. Admiral Jeremiah, as you know, was an admiral of the United States Navy, and after a very distinguished career culminating as the vice chairman of the JCS. That gave him very good insight into the requirements and the acquisition process and the role that the National Reconnaissance Systems play in critical support to military operations around the world. I could think of no one better qualified to come in and do this work for us, and to do so with a degree of credibility and insight and intellect that he brings to the task. We were very fortunate to have him agree to do this work because it was a major effort requiring a tremendous amount of his time. And I am most pleased today to introduce to you Admiral Dave Jeremiah to give you some introductory remarks on his effort. Admiral Jeremiah.
I'm delighted to be here this morning and see you all. I haven't seen you since the last time the fire alarm went out and we all assembled outside. That gave me an opportunity to get a sense of the organization, as I believe all of the panel members did over the last few months, as it turned out. And it was a very instructive exercise for us. I would tell you that probably half of us came in predisposed to be very critical of the organization and its practices. Some of you may say at the end of the end of this session that we still were, but the differences in specific areas. The questions we had in the beginning were organizational and mission-oriented. The product that you will see today reaffirms the necessity for an organization like this. The National Reconnaissance Organization is one of the crown jewels of the United States. It has been the vehicle that has given us enormous leverage around the world, not only in the late 60s and 70s and the halcyon days when anything you did was a technological breakthrough that no one had ever thought possible, but also today when our friends and allies are increasingly exposed to the kinds of leverage that you provide to the United States with the magnificent systems that are available only to the United States. Many of those friends and allies and opponents felt that they were pretty close until they saw those products in places like Bosnia and to some degree in Somalia, and certainly in Desert Storm. And I think that was an eye-opener that causes you to be concerned now because you have competition. People are going to be working real hard to emulate that which you have been able to put together over these many years. There's no way in the world that they can do that. Not only because of the resources that are required, but also because of the tremendous collection of people, men and women, civilians and military, who have been pulled together into a very, very unique organization. So we looked at that question of should there be an NRO, and we struggled with that question and with the mission question for some little time, probably the first 5 or 6 weeks in which we worked with the organization while the sub-panels were off working on other areas that Mike will talk to you about, in business practices and personnel practices and other kinds of things. We came away with the clear conviction that the United States needs the National Reconnaissance Organization. We came away with a clear conviction that you have a mission well into the 21st century and beyond. That mission is going to be one that is extraordinarily complex because you are no longer permitted to throw something up, take a picture, and sit back and wait for the accolades. It's going to be tougher because you have to integrate into a variety of systems, and that in itself introduces complexity. You have to manage that complexity in a way so that your clients and your customers and your suppliers don't have to really struggle with it as intensely as I think some have been doing over the last 15 or 20 years. Part of that is classification. Part of that has been the very exploding nature of the technology and the kinds of integration that we have been trying to accomplish. You're going to be on the other side of that curve a little bit now, and I think you cannot allow the need to deal with complex systems to drive you to complex work packages. I think you'll see a package in here in the briefing that shows the size of the RFQ of a program and the size of the response, both for the basic response and for the BAFO. And we need to get away from that. You can't just say put it all on a disk because it still takes the same amount of time and energy and effort and plotting to get through that. The mission is we suggest that your mission will change. we suggest that your mission is going to move into a slightly different form, that it's going to be information rather than intelligence, that you are processing and moving. That does not mean that you're in the zeros and ones business and therefore you are impervious to what's going on in the system. This is an intelligence operation, and we spent several weeks on that. We worked hard at taking the combination of space, defense, and intelligence as they look at in a Venn diagram and pulling that apart, and you'll see that, to try and test the margins and find out where the real center of gravity of the organization is. And it was clear to all of us that the center of gravity is in the intelligence world, whether or not you're using space systems to accomplish that. That is your particular vehicle, but it is intelligence that is the product, and that's what you have to understand in order to know how to build and how to handle and how to operate large systems, large integrated systems, and how to engineer them into existence in the first place. We did not look at the building of buildings, nor did we look at the financing of things. We have some opinions on both of those subjects. There's no need to repeat those opinions here today, but I think those are things you put behind you and go forward for whatever reason they were brought into the public milieu. I think that you have to recognize that this is a tremendously powerful organization and a huge lever for the United States during a period of time when many of the other tools that we have used are reducing in size, being consolidated, and changed in some fairly dramatic ways. You also will have to change. You'll have to pick up new and different ways of doing business, I think. But the capability you have is a constant. Now, if that capability is only to replicate that which you already have and make it a little better, we are fearful that you will not be where you need to be 20 years from now. And if you're not there, neither is the United States. That's a hard nut because you're dealing with declining budgets. And you'll see in here a system, or a couple of charts that characterize the NRO and the attributes of the NRO, the way it was in the past, the way it is today, and the way it has to be in the future. But if you have to, in the face of tough budgets, figure out how to move the systems forward into a different world, replacing that which is there with better systems and systems that are far more innovative than they are today. Your clients will want you to give them sort of what they got, only a little bit better. Because something different than that costs them more, don't understand it, not necessary, da-da-da-da-da-da-da. Don't believe it. You have to think through that and then be very eloquent spokespersons back into the system to help your clients understand the true differences in the capabilities that you can provide them. You're going to see a briefing that Mike Munson is going to give you, and it's going to walk through many of these things. And you're going to see in the sub-panel reports in particular that we take on particular issues. We take those issues on and study them because we thought they were important. Many of you participated in those issues. We may not have gone as far as some of you would like, and we may have gone much farther than others of you may have thought right. But we've tried to strike the correct balance, or the best balance we saw on each individual issue, and how those issues interrelate and deal with the whole system that's represented by the NRO. I think that's probably as far as I want to take it, or Mike will have not much to say. I want to leave you with the thought that Bill Perry in particular and John Deutsch also focused on innovation as an important element of what's going on. They focused on business practices and improving those business practices so that you have a cleaner slate. And they clearly believe that the mission statement is much more pertinent for the future than that which we see today. They also focused on systems engineering, and I would call it macro systems engineering. It's not how you get one particular system sorted out. It's how you tie that whole complex of stuff together so that you can do sensor to shooter in a tactical basis and go direct from provider to the retail customer if it's necessary, be it a pilot in a cockpit or the front end of a cruise missile, on the one hand, and provide what the President of the United States needs to see in very succinct, encapsulated form on the other, and how all of that stuff moves back and forth in the system in a way that whoever needs it can get it as rapidly as we can sense it. You're doing a great job. Don't let them grind you down. We think you are a national treasure. Don't let your head get too big.
That concludes my remarks. Are there any questions? It's a pleasure to be here and give you this little chat. It's sort of a summary. It is a summary of what we came up with, and I think you'll find it very interesting. You will find some parts controversial. If we didn't have some parts in there that are controversial, we probably didn't do our job. You know, while we're having the study, the acting director of the NRO came in and said, let's take a look at it and tell me what we need to do in the 21st century. I would say that that's one of the interesting things that the NRO does over the last 10 years that other organizations haven't done. You had a major study in 88 or 89, another one in 92, maybe a couple of them in 92, I don't know. It's interesting that an organization takes on responsibility to do that sort of thing, that sort of self-inspection, if you will. Not too many organizations do that. You probably have to do it more in the business world because you've got to constantly be reviewing exactly what your customer base is and what your product base is. But not too many government agencies do that. That's, I think, a mark of a world-class organization. You're in the midst of significant transition. NRO systems are in the trade space, the financial trade space for the DoD and the NFIP much more than they used to be. It was a few years back when they were in the NFIP, but only marginally. They're now actually in the NFIP and in the DoD budget hearings. Major transition to integrated systems, you all know that. They're more complex to deal with. Relevance of military support is much higher. The Pentagon has discovered the tremendous benefits of using national reconnaissance assets in warfare, and we're seeing some of the benefits of those in the actual conflicts and pre-conflicts that this nation's involved in. Greater openness, you're aware of that. It's in the Department of Defense with new Deputy Undersecretary of Defense for Space, with a space architect, with the Joint Space Management Board, and you all know that it's up on the Hill. You're in a period where the nation is spending more money in the economic and domestic areas, so of necessity to get that money one of the areas that you go to is Defense Department, and that causes your budget to be a little more open also. Your credibility over the last short period of time has been challenged. First by the building, which was, in my view, a complete and total bad rap, and then secondly by the forward funding area, which you're right now in the process of fixing. And you've got an industrial base that's also in a transition, just like your organization itself. We used this chart to try and show the changing environment, and we found it very useful. In the past, you had a denied area reconnaissance problem with the USSR, but right now they expect worldwide intelligence. Systems are integrated. You have more budget limitations. Management is more integrated and therefore more complex. Oversight, as you well know, is expanding. Acquisition used to be more streamlined. It's becoming more burdened right now. It's our assessment. Security, greater openness. You take folks that have spent most of their life trying to protect things, and now you're asking them, how much can I let out without hurting the national security? Organization, you've changed. Requirements are much more towards the operational area, and your customer set is ever expanding as people understand exactly what you do and how you do it, how well you do it. What did we address? It's right up there. Mission, infrastructure, processes, business practices, and then a series of other areas. The areas that we addressed were identified for us pretty much by Keith Hall. He told us what he wanted us to look at. He also told us what he didn't need help in. Programmatics, the specific programs that you're working on now, we didn't go into those. The financial area, John Nelson has got a head start on, and I think probably doing an extremely good job on. We didn't look at specific architectures, and we didn't look at items that we felt the Jeremiah panel could not, of necessity, impact because they were external influences and factors outside of the National Reconnaissance Office. This is the panel. I want to make a couple points about the panel itself. You have on that panel distinguished Americans from private industry. You have distinguished Americans from the national intelligence arena. You have distinguished people on that panel that know space, and that you have distinguished people on there that are Defense Department with a great background in defense. So you have with that group of 6 people, I think an outstanding group of Americans that gave you a cross-section of what they thought needed to be in the National Reconnaissance Office. And you heard the Admiral say that there was some predisposition towards being constructively critical, and that's good. It was there, and that's good, and I think that's why the panel report is is such a strong product. Those are the working groups on the bottom. Can you move the chart up a little? Oh, move it up so we can see the bottom. We tried to have members of most organizations, both internally and externally. We tried to have a diffuse group, and I think we were reasonably successful. When you have 9 panels, it was a very busy time, but I think we were very successful. I want to make the point again that both the panel and the working group were made up of individuals that have very strong bona fides in all the areas that we were looking for. I wanted also to talk a little bit and give you some names about individuals that we interviewed. And again, once more, private industry, space expertise, defense expertise, intelligence expertise. We kicked off with Ambassador Lynn Hansen from the National Intelligence Community. We had Jim Woolsey, we had Tom Moorman, Bob Herman, Mike McConnell, Jeff Harris. We had Senator Kerry, Congressman Dix. We had Congressman Combest. We had staffers on both authorization committees. We had Dr. John Foster. We had Bob Davis from the Pentagon. We had Admiral Frost, the desync out at Spacecom. We had Dwayne I think he's the Chief Operating Officer of Lockheed Martin now. And we also did Ken Minahan. So a strong group of people all the way around. The area in the middle is the area we focused on. That's your area of the world. It's the intersection of space, defense, and intelligence. I wanted to start it off by talking about the measures in the National Reconnaissance Office that we felt needed to be preserved. Most of the briefing talks about areas where we think there are improvements that can be made, but I think it would be inappropriate to talk about those without talking at first for the areas that we think need to be preserved. And the first one, of course, is the joint venture between the intelligence community and the Department of Defense. You heard Admiral Jeremiah talk about how much time we spent on the mission and whether or not we need an NRO. The first question was, do you need an NRO-like organization? The second question is, okay, if the answer to that question is yes, then is the answer the NRO, or is it a different organization? We spent a long time looking at those two questions, and in the final analysis, you need an NRO-like organization, and the best answer to it as far as the panel was concerned is the NRO. It is a joint venture organization between the intelligence community and the Department of Defense. Both of those, the Secretary of Defense and the DCI, have enormous equities in the area of national security, and the NRO is uniquely postured to satisfy those equities. Being there and getting the people that they get to work in the NRO, you bring unique perspectives and expertise from both sides of the field. It has a critical mass of technical expertise. Very, very important, probably the best in the world. Highly motivated and competent workforce. Yeah, that's you. Government, industry, multidisciplinary teams, and superior manning. Both under normal circumstances, both the CIA and the services realize the importance of the organization and give it priority in terms of its manning. Yes, it may not seem to you today that it is as good as it was 10 years ago, but I can assure you it's much better than most other organizations in the intelligence community and in the Department of Defense. Streamlined and empowered management. This is an area that we feel like needs to be preserved and in fact enhanced and strengthened. But in the areas that you've got to preserve, we thought we needed to bring it up here as well as when we talk to it later in areas where it needs to be strengthened. Empowered management, minimal layers of management over you. We think that needs to continue as best it can. It may not exist throughout the organization, but wherever it exists, it needs to stay. And where it's been eroded as a result of natural growth of the organization, it needs to be reconstituted. Special contracting and security authorities are very, very important to the success of the organization. They must continue. We think flexible forward funding policy is very, very important. It'll be in our report. It'll go to the Hill. They may or may not like it up there, but that's the way the panel felt. Acquisition authority enables the rapid fielding of new systems. It's not always used in that way. We think that you need to take a look at the way you're doing it and determine whether or not you should continue in some areas with some programs that you've already started on the track that you're on, and then in others we would encourage you to pick up a faster pace of doing things, and certainly the Secretary of Defense would like to see that. Cradle to grave, we spent a long time on the cradle to grave issue. I remember when I first came in, I had a courtesy call with General Scanlon, and General Scanlon wanted to talk to that particular issue, probably a little concerned about whether or not the panel would come down and say you can take operations and split it out. We spent a lot of time looking at it, and in the final analysis we decided that there were benefits to cradle to grave, leaving it in the NRO. And more importantly, we didn't see any reason strong enough to go the other way, to break up the cradle to grave. So we came down for that. Leading edge technology, world-class systems engineering. These are trademarks of the NRO, and they need to continue. responsiveness to customer, fielding systems that make use of the technology. We think you're responsive to the customer. In some cases, that causes you a little difficulty, and I'm going to get into that a little more in detail further on in the briefing. In summary, and we'll get into some specific recommendations now. Unanimous finding, the NRO is still needed. We felt that given the recommendations that we had, if you take the recommendations we have in totality, we felt that that would amount to a significant change in the organization. Not any one specific recommendation, but when you take a look at all the recommendations, we felt there would be a significant change. This is the issue summary, and it really has the questions of the issues that we're going to talk about here. I guess there's 12 of them. I guess at one time we had 13, and we dropped down to 11. We ended up with 12. I'll give you a second to take a look at them, and then we're going to go into each one of them specifically. Okay. Is there an alternative for the NRO? This was a 5-week effort. The panel, under no circumstance, was ready to launch off and do a study of the NRO until they were actually able to determine whether or not you, A, needed an NRO, and B, should the NRO be the NRO that we had now. We looked at somewhere between 10 and 15 different constructs. We looked at not having an NRO. We looked at moving it into DUSD space. We looked at moving it into the Air Force. We looked at doing away with it and putting parts in the disciplines, in imagery, MASCENT, and SIGINT. We looked at moving it, I think, back into CIA. We looked at moving it to SpaceCom. We looked at moving it down to the Air Force, but keeping it separate from Space and Missile Command. We looked at merging it with Space and Missile Command. In each of those areas, we looked at about 25 different attributes, 25 or 30 different attributes that an effective organization would have to carry out the work of the National Reconnaissance Office. And they dealt with things like, what impact does this have on imagery? What does it have on SIGINT? How does this deal with SMO? What do the authorization committees think? What do the appropriations committees think? Does the DCI's equity suffer under this construct, or does the does the Secretary of Defense's equities suffer in this? We looked at all these constructs. The bottom line was, it's a joint venture. The organization's a joint venture between the DCI and the Secretary of Defense, and they each have enormous equities in the area of national security, as I mentioned before, that are satisfied by the National Reconnaissance Office as a joint venture. If you move the organization from one side to the other, you're going to have an equity problem. If you've been in Washington for any more than 5 years or 10 years in the bureaucracy, that's not a hard thing to understand. So all the alternatives that we looked at were unsatisfactory. Space reconnaissance, we're absolutely certain, will remain critical in the future, probably more critical than even in the past. The common space systems are the best solution. We couldn't go with an arrangement or a construct that said, Department of Defense, you go ahead and take over the parts of the National Reconnaissance Organization or assets that relate to the military and the DCI, then move the others over to the DCI. It's way too expensive. Right now, what you really have is you have best compromise solutions when you build them, and you build wonderful satellites, and it works that way, and any other way to do it is just simply too expensive. So the recommendation was, after 5 weeks, was to keep the NRO as it is, keep it as the NRO, and that's the way you take care of the DCI joint venture, DCI SecDef joint venture. Again, these are some of the organizations that you deal with in your area of the world. It is the Venn diagram that intersects space, intelligence, and defense. We had a lot of questions, and we'll get into some of it a little later. Do you optimize intelligence for defense? and intelligence for the nation, or do you optimize the use of space? I would tell you when Mr. Davis from Defense came, his job is to optimize space. He thought that everything that goes up in space needs to be optimized for the use of space. The panel said no. The panel said the function is intelligence. We optimize intelligence. To the extent we can, we need to work in a space world, and we need to share as much as we can with other organizations that use space as a place. But make no mistake about it, the space is the place and intelligence is the function, and there was no debate with that with the Secretary of Defense or with the DCI. The next point we took, and a very serious point, was what should the future mission of the NRO be? Information security is a national security imperative. If you've taken a look at, if you saw Mr. Deutsch's speech at an ARPA convention not too long ago, you've heard what he has to say about that. If you read the comments that have been written about Mr. Deutsch and the need for security in cyberspace and things like that over the last 2 weeks even, you pretty well can understand where he feels like the future is. If you go to the Pentagon and you sit down with the J6 or the JCS, or the seniors in the Pentagon, they talk about dominant battlefield awareness or dominant battlefield knowledge. Again, this is information superiority in the battlefield. So you've got information superiority from John Deutsch. You've got it from the Secretary of Defense. You've got the President forming a special task force to take a look at the national information infrastructure. You've got the new DERNSA setting up a new organization to take a look at information warfare. You have the Pentagon putting aside an enormous amount of money last year to do defensive and offensive information protection or information warfare. So I don't think there's much doubt of where we need to go in the future. People realize that it has to be information superiority. There's an enormous glut of information out there now with the new internet. Probably not new right now, but with the internet out there and with the expanding numbers of television stations and direct TV and a much greater amount of information that's available in open source, the name of the game in the future is going to be information superiority. The nation that can get the information, process the information into a usable form, and get that information out to its users is the nation that's going to be ahead of the curve. Space reconnaissance, of course, is a major enabler to that, and there will be a push in all the NRO areas, I think, to get more information in all of them. The way the National Security Agency is going to collect and process information in the future is going to lead to the collection of more information. The same is true of the imagery capability, and certainly in the area of comms, there's absolutely no question that they're going to have to be able to deal with infinitely larger amount of data. So clearly, the new mission statement is before you, and the two parts I would emphasize to you. Most of it comes from your last mission statement. A lot of it is very, very similar to it, but there are two major changes. One has to do with information superiority. That's your challenge for the future. And the second has to do with related intelligence activities that are needed to conduct this. And what we're doing there is we're widening the charter just a little bit. We think it's necessary. You have three capabilities that no other intelligence organization can even come close to. You have, in our view, adequate funding. Certainly not for everything, but if you take a look at the other intelligence organizations, you have adequate funding. You have an enormous base of expertise within the organization, far beyond, in our view, any other organization. And you have an enormous contractor industrial base. And that makes you an unbelievably capable organization, capable to do all sorts of things. And because of that, your organization also gets pulled and asked to do things that perhaps aren't its charter, and a good example is the whole dissemination issue. You've got, Kirk comes by and gives you a briefing and shows you all the organizations in the NFIP that have the word dissemination in their charter, except one that doesn't have it is the National Reconnaissance Office. And yet, who did the vice chairman come to get the job done when it can't get done any other way? They come to the National Reconnaissance Office. We think the DCI, and indeed the Secretary, have to have that little opening in your mission statement that allows them to use you for the benefit of the nation in the intelligence area, but perhaps not just strictly for intelligence collection. And the specific area that we were talking about here has to do with requirement that's going to be in the future. Sure. The mission of the National Reconnaissance Office of the 21st century is to enable U.S. government and military information superiority during peace through war. The NRO is responsible for the unique technology, large-scale systems engineering, development and acquisition and operation of space reconnaissance systems, and related intelligence activities needed to support this national security imperative. I mentioned customers before, and it's time for me to say a few more things about customers. You're sort of in a unique situation. At first, you really were, your job was, I guess, to collect information, turn it over to the discipline managers. The discipline managers would process and then take it on to the customers. And you weren't at that time probably viewed necessarily as an organization responsible for customer satisfaction. Indeed, now when you get into that area, the discipline managers and certainly DIA and others just sort of raise their eyebrows and say, well, I wonder why the NRO is doing that. It's really somebody else's job, or it's my job, or something like that. It's a necessary growth with the times. The INTs don't do all the processing now. You do some of the processing. By virtue of their lack of capability in some areas, the NFIP, without probably the necessary money, without probably the expertise base that you have, and certainly without your contractor base, they haven't been able to get some of the things done that need to get done, and your organization has stepped in the void, and that's the way it should be. The important thing is getting the product to the end user. Having said that, we find several units that are working in charters. We have line units that attempt to market new capabilities. We have an unevenness in terms of how you deal with the customers, and we basically see not a lot of consistent practices. We think that the result is confusion and often erodes some of the customer relationships. What we're proposing in the report is that we develop a more coherent, cohesive customer approach or program in the NRO. And I think what that basically means is a centralized planning, policy, and perhaps oversight to some degree, and a decentralized operational capability. We can't take taking care of IMINT customers out of IMINT. Only IMINT knows how to do that and do that well. But there probably needs to be more synergy across the organization. So our proposal will be that that we form a team internally and take a look probably at exactly how we can get a more even program for our customers. And then once you come up with a draft, I would suggest that you probably want to float it into your major customer areas and get their comments on it. But I think you want to take a look at it internally first. And of course, it has to be an equitable arrangement with the NSAs and the NEMAs and the DIAs of the world. They have to feel like you're not out in front of them. They have to feel like they're working with you and you're working with them. And that's pretty hard for you. It's not your problem. It's really their problem. So you sort of have to, in my view, trying to figure out how you're going to hold hands and bring them along in this dual relationship. Support to military operations. I always get a chuckle out of the Gulf War shortfalls. We did a couple of studies back when Mr. Hall was just a lowly Deputy Assistant Secretary for Intelligence, and I was a lowly office chief working for him. And we took a look at a lot of the problems, and my bottom line was, how bad could it have been? It was a 2-day war. You know, we lost 100 people. Give me a break. And when actually we looked at the dissemination problem in my office, we did a great big study, probably about this thick. The biggest problem was in the field, and was the manual handling of the documents. The administrative arrangement of the units in the field simply were not adequate to move the documents. It was some things like not a big enough storage area, no car, one person in one car when you needed 2 cars. It was all sorts of real down-to-earth, simple problems. Nevertheless, they were there. So in my view, and in the view of the panel, the concerns were more perception, sometimes reality. Clearly, security has been a major issue with respect to SMO support, but I think we're getting out ahead of that. I think we're on the right track, and I think everybody is moving on it. Recommendation, formalize some responsibilities with OSD, JCS, and particularly Spacecom. Continue to downgrade information for support to military operations. You saw what happens if you don't. I spoke earlier this week at a security conference. The Secretary and the DCI got together last August or September after the Defense Science Board team got back from Bosnia, and the question was, the point was we're not getting enough information there. And the Secretary says, how do we make everything secret so people can use it? And the DCI, I think, said, you can do that, or maybe it was the other way around. And he says, okay, I've done it, let's do it. And 9 months later, it was done. Well, I don't think you want it to work that way. I think you need to, I think the organizations need to have the impetus behind that. Don't go to the boss and ask him, because when it goes like that, sometimes we get implementation that's a little uneven and doesn't take into consideration some aspects that we all have to deal with. We want to start a DoD training program for SINCs. That's not necessarily the 4 stars, but it's the people that use your systems, and we want to rate them. We want to have them come in, learn what they can, or we'll go out. I don't know how you want to do it. And then we want to give them a little test and see if they actually know the systems and know how to use them. And then we want to relay that information to their bosses so that they can either be understand that we can that they're ready to go to war, or that they're not ready to use your systems in war. We also want to develop appropriate system simulation. There was a feeling in the panel that there wasn't a strong enough effort that took a look at the fusion of imagery, SIGINT, and massive information for the customer. We've got a lot of simulation efforts throughout the Department of Defense and in intelligence, but none of them, the panel felt, that focused enough on the simulation, the fusion of satellite information. Is the NRO an innovative organization? The recommendation is, in the panel, is that the NRO adopt a fusion capability. My proposal to Mr. Hall on the implementation will be to implement a capability like that, but really to first do a review of what capabilities exist throughout the community, what's being done now, and then to figure out how the NRO can work with what's being done now. And my vision doesn't necessarily have the NRO developing the fusion capability. I'm not sure that's the right solution. I do think you need a fusion capability, and I think the NRO needs to be a major player, if not the major player. But I'm not sure you want to have that capability just here. Is the NRO an innovative organization? We judge the current acquisition processes to be essentially working very well for evolutionary systems, but that they have a certain set of disadvantages to them. We feel like they're driven by risk aversion, that they contain overly detailed specifications. They tell you how to do something, not what you want to do. We feel the processes favor the incumbents. They do not, of course, deal with the information superiority imperative that we see in the future. And they do not, in our view, have the level of competition that's necessary to stimulate innovation. Now, why are they that way? We feel that they're that way because of the evolution of the organization. The organization now has a major operational responsibility. You don't have the luxury of having, I don't know how many failures you had with the Corona system before it finally worked. Your satellites have to work. The military needs them all day long, every day. They have to work. They have to be fail-safe. They sort of have to be risk-averse, frankly. And that's what the customer has demanded. And you have responded to your customer. And that's as it should be. But the feeling was that the revolutionary capabilities that the nation will need in the future, the ability to jump over a generation and create the capabilities in the future, are not created by this evolutionary path. Now, in the sense of the kind of practices that you have to use, you're a little bit bifurcated. You have to be more risk averse in some areas. But we're going to make a strong pitch for you to do two things. One, create pilot programs in your organization and go to more innovative processes for acquiring and developing systems. And two, we're going to ask you to take a look at the systems that you're working now and the processes that you're working now, and see if there aren't some areas in there that you can go to more practices. I want to say something about an innovative organization. The NRO is an innovative organization, always has been. When we're talking about innovation, though, we're really talking about revolutionary innovation. We're not necessarily talking about the enormous changes and very valuable changes that you make in your evolutionary systems developments. You know, you could clearly say that moving to an EIS system or truly innovation. You could say that, and that would be true. But we're really talking about revolutionary changes. We're talking about, I don't know, maybe and small sats and things like that. And we feel like those are the capabilities that put the NRO first as the world's best reconnaissance organization. We feel like we have to get back to some of that. We think we need to increase competition, and that will stimulate innovation. Go back to the what you want and try and get away from the how, when you can, and if you can. And you can't always, but we at least think you ought to give it an honest look to do that. Review and revise the investment priority for R&D and innovation. Your monies for R&D at least captured or run something like 5%, and they run something like 5% as far back as I went to take a look at them. That's not necessarily good. World-class organizations spend a lot more than 5%, and if you've been at 5% for 10 years, you're not at 5%. You may be at 3.5%, but you're not at 5%. And we think the NRO should be restructured to make sure that innovation and R&D get at least as much priority and emphasis as the major organizations in the NRO. And so we're sort of looking at a dual track here, revolutionary track. And one other thing that came out of the benchmarking working group, they took a look at the amount of money and innovation. And in world-class organizations, about 60% of the R&D money went into revolutionary changes and 40% into improving products that you already have. We found that the NRO figures were just about flipped on that. You've got your evolutionary path, but we think over years that may decline in value. We're not proposing you not do one, but do the other. We know you have to do both. There's no question about that. So the tough part, the easy part is coming up with a proposal. The very tough part is to take a look at it within your organizations and determine exactly what you can do and what you can't do. NRO business practices, another very, this and Cradle to Grave were long, long discussions with the panel and within the working groups. The historic business practices, at first we were told, well, they're unique. We took a look at them. We took a look at the Polaris program. We took a look at Special Navy. We took a look at Stealth. We took a look at others. They're not unique. Now, they are essentially the benchmark under which a lot of these other organizations, super organizations that create great capabilities for this nation, they are and have been used as the benchmark to create these capabilities for other organizations. But they're no longer unique. Their decline over time, we feel, have resulted in less innovation, more use of an evolutionary path, increased staff and CAS usage. Somebody mentioned the amount of CAS went up in the last 3 years. Is that true? Overly detailed specifications, many ECPs, increased costs, and some erosion of confidence. The recommendation: reverse the decline. Emphasize the objectives, foster competition and innovation, increase contractor responsibility. I think I've heard Dave Keir, I know Dave Keir is working on an IPT with respect to acquisition. We think you probably need more. If you do all that, you might be able to minimize some of the data and reports that you can. And again, this is not a prescription for each of your programs, but it is something that you need to take a look probably for each of your programs. It probably doesn't fit everything, but you need to give it an honest shot. Should systems engineering be strengthened? This subject came up this morning. Bob DeMay was standing on the conference table talking about this one. His fist was high in his hand, and I couldn't tell whether he liked it or not, actually. The findings: we think the stovepipe still exists. Technology insertion and innovation are in some cases fragmented. The architectures probably are not integrated across all the systems as well as perhaps they should be. We think you need a sort of a systems of systems architecture. And right now we sort of see an evolution of it rather than a more revolutionary approach. The recommendation is just to establish a systems engineering authority. The panel was told that the NRO did that several years ago and put it in P&A and then dropped it. Perhaps that's the place that it ought to go. We'd leave that up to further study. The group, the Systems Engineering Authority, would advocate technical insertion. It would build building codes for architectural standards. It would emphasize integration. It would continue to coordinate the requirements process and interface with the DoD space community. And just generally try and see that each of your systems fit into the other system in an overall architecture that includes other systems, and then perhaps in a bigger architecture when you have to do things like queuing among and between DoD space systems, queuing among and between your systems and then cross-queuing. And I don't think it has to be raised up beyond where it's at now necessarily, Bob. I think that it's not an attempt to put or make this a higher level analysis. Just try and give it a little more focus. How should the NRO interact with DoD space organizations? Actually, we took a look at how the NRO should react to many organizations, probably 10 or 15 DoD organizations. But we focused in the space area. The NRO is first and foremost an intelligence organization. We already talked about that. Mr. Davis would like it to be a space organization first and foremost. It didn't work out that way. It conducts its mission from the place, which is space. Space interfaces at your level work very well, the operational, technical, and planning level. We feel like they work very well. With the creation of the DESD space outfit, and the Joint Space Management Board, and the Space Architect, there's new relationships that have to develop. in the policy, architecture, and oversight level. And we think actually that you're working on those and then that you're on the right track. We like the idea of one architecture, but two architects. Not sure we want to go any further than that. There should be closer coordination with DESD Space, and I think that's getting better as we speak. The report calls for additional interfaces with Space and Missile Command and closer relations with SpaceCom. We looked at personnel. The two issues that we really tried to deal with in terms of personnel, the first has to do with military rotations and assignments. Apparently you came from an era where individuals came to work for the NRO, worked for the NRO most of their career in the Air Force and other areas, and then retired out of the NRO. Individuals got priority treatment in terms of promotions and things like that. A little bit of that has changed. Individuals now get rotated out of the NRO, and some come back, some don't. Actually, the rotations, if they're measured and at the right time, is probably a good idea. You probably want your people to be more balanced in terms of their experience, understand how things go out in the other world, in Air Force, space world, and in the user community and things like that. So you want a more balanced look, but you don't want it to get out of hand. And with respect to military, the Air Force and the Navy, we're recommending that the next DNRO establish a series or a couple of memorandums of understanding with both the Air Force and the Navy that take care of three areas. One, provides the best possible career opportunities for the military person. Two, meets the requirements for the military, the Navy, and the Air Force in terms of what they need to have that individual have experience in. And three, satisfies the requirements for that individual to be a productive employee for the National Reconnaissance Office. In the area of civilian personnel, we have an interesting situation in that Mr. Hall really has not as much authority and control over his organization, over his civilian personnel as, in our view, he should have. He's responsible for putting satellites up, and he's responsible for the nation's security, but if he wants to promote, he's not responsible to do that. He has to figure out, he can't do that on his own. If he wants to fire, he can't do that either. If he wants to rule on equal opportunity suit, he can't get involved in that. That just goes to the Central Intelligence Agency. He doesn't have the authority and responsibilities that I had in DIA. He doesn't even come close to them. And it's patently not fair and doesn't work well when you've got a person who's responsible for the output of an organization, but he's not responsible for its people. So we've recommended that there be a couple of MOUs here signed, one between the Secretary and the DCI, and the second between the Executive Director of CIA and the DNRO, that would give the DICS DNRO much more authority and responsibility over the people that are assigned here from CIA. We're not asking for anything out of the ordinary. We think they're just sort of common sense type arrangements. We think he ought to sit on the CIA board that picks SISs, that he shouldn't have to have other people do his bidding necessarily in that area. Is the security system appropriate? This was interesting. The working group came back and said, ruthlessly accelerate decompartmentation and declassification. And then we thought, well, this is probably going to be an unclassified part of the report, and we didn't want to see the word ruthlessly on the front page of the Washington Post. So we took out the word ruthlessly. But the fact of the matter is that we do feel like there needs to be a good, strong scrub, and we need to reduce as much as possible out of there. And I honestly think that the security folks have been working this for quite some time. There's no doubt that there's been, I think, great improvement and I think there's room for more improvement, but I think they're on the right course. Should the contractor relationships be classified? When I first came in, I sat in on a couple of Mr. Hall's orientations, and I remember the one from security, and if I remember right, I went away with there, and I'll say it this way so I'm not picking on anyone. I went away with the perception that the corporate relationships needed to stay covert because all of those companies wanted it that way. And that was the perception that I had. When the group went out and polled some of them, they found that in fact 60% of them, and they didn't poll all of them, but a good percentage of them found that that particular constraint was harmful to them, and they wanted to do away with it. We think that you'll probably, if you accelerate the decompartmentation, you will probably see eventually something like 85% of the organizations in the corporate world that have relationships with the NRO end up declassifying those specific relationships. Some will remain. There are some good security reasons to do it. Some have concerns about people overseas. Some have concerns about products that they sell overseas. We also find that the corporate relationships inhibit competition. They do it in two ways. Number one, those organizations that don't have the clearances don't get involved in competition for the most part. And number two, many of those organizations that do have the clearances don't have enough of them. So it's an inhibitor in both areas. So our recommendation is to accelerate the decompartmentation and declassification. Current internal organization structure well matched for the future. We're making some proposals for changes, I think, and they evolve around several, I'll say 3 or 4 areas. One is the R&D area and the innovation area, and the requirement that we think is absolutely critical that the NRO puts much more emphasis on research and development, innovation, increased competition, and using different and business practices in many cases than they use right now. We think that the OSA or an OSA-like organization ought to be on the same level with MNSIGINT and COM, and that's one. Another one has to do with the systems of systems concept, and we think that that needs to be given more emphasis. And our recommendation, I guess, in the group is to take a P&A-like organization, and maybe the strawman organization we have gives P&A that responsibility. P&A, incidentally, turned out to be the organization you love to hate in some situations. There were, I know you're going to be surprised about this, Jeff, but there were some people out there that weren't real happy with your ombudsman role. To my way of thinking, if everybody was unhappy with P&A, that probably means they were doing a good job. They're in a very difficult place, and they're not going to be able to keep everybody happy. Now, perhaps there's some areas that there's more bureaucracy than is necessary, but you don't have a P&A to keep everybody happy. They do all sorts of things. They're just sort of no, I won't say it. A necessary evil was what I was thinking. Sort of like the IG sitting down there in his second row. Everybody has to have them, and when they walk in, they always say, "I'm the IG, and I'm glad to be here," and you say, "And we're glad you're here," and you're both lying. Yeah, the customer relations is another area, and this involves strengthening probably a centralized capability, but not centralizing customer relations. You can't do that. That won't work. And the last recommendation, I would say, the panel thinks that you need to have a senior advisory board. It needs to be working for the DNRO. And you use that board to try and make sure that you're in tune with the developments in commercial technology. So you get it's a scientific type board. You pick people from the commercial area You do not pick Defense Science Board members. You do not pick senior managers, ex-DCIs, people like that. You pick people like the vice president or the chief operating officer of Microsoft and folks like that. And they help you make sure you're focusing. They help you, A, understand what's going on in the commercial world, and B, help you focus in the areas that you are. And the next chart is a notional chart that we put up. There was an attempt to come to a different, more streamlined organization that died after a barrel of gunfire at one of the panel meetings. But this is a notional chart. This has the benefit of creating a future technology and applications organization on the same level of SIG and IM to provide that emphasis on R&D and innovation that we're saying needs to be done. It also has your systems engineering plans and analysis office. It has a senior advisory board. I don't know, maybe it elevates OSO. I'm not sure. It also puts finance and administration together. Next chart. That's a summary of the recommendations. You can't read them. I'll read them. Continue the DCI-SecDef joint venture. Adopt the new mission statement, highlighting information superiority. Those are two very key recommendations. Design customer support process to include responsibilities, policies, and practices. Refine SMO policies and responsibilities and press the downgrading. Increase competition to stimulate innovation and achieve a revolutionary architecture. That's a key recommendation. Reinvigorate NRO business practices. That's a key recommendation. Establish NRO-level authorities and processes for systems engineering. Refine and clarify NRO relationships with other DoD space organizations. Work with CIA and the services to invigorate personnel management systems. Accelerate plan changes to shrink the security system. Decompartment, declassify NRO corporate relationships, and reorganize the NRO to emphasize systems engineering, customer relations, innovative technology, and SMO. The next chart, the changing environment. Where does that put you in the 21st century? It puts you at information superiority. You become more fully integrated. Resources, you're going to continue to receive scrutiny in that area. Cost effectiveness, which wasn't a problem back in when you began, will be a problem in the future. Won't go away. The joint SecDef DCI arrangement needs to continue. Acquisition needs to take a look at best practices and wherever possible, make sure that they're being used. Streamline the security system. Make sure that your customer support is matched to your customers. Near continuous global collection is what you're going to need in the future, both in the SIGINT area and the IMINT area, and also in MASIN. And that will, we think, involve some revolutionary work. And of course, continued growth of your customers. So that pretty well summarizes the panel. That's 12 major areas. There are some 55 to 60 recommendations. I've probably covered about, in a general forum, probably 40 or 45 of those 12 recommendations. There are specific recommendations under each one. Key points, again, a magnificent organization, a world-class organization, the best in the world, needs to stay that way. I think the constructive review that takes place every 4 years helps it to do that. I come from DIA, many of you know that. In DIA we get a new director. Hopefully it's every 4 years, but in last year it was, we had 3 directors in a year. Each director comes in, has his own program, his own emphasis, and everybody turns to and goes and marches off in that direction. The directions are all different. They're not wrong. They're just different. The NRO way of doing things, having a panel come in, an outside panel come in of experts, work together with the people inside and other experts outside, make recommendations, and then move forward is, I think, in the best interests of the nation. I think it's a much better, more fundamentally strong way to do this. So if I had to encapsulate, I'd say the two major areas would be information superiority in the future, and we need to take a constructive look at our business practices and how we can improve innovation. I know that's hard. I know the environment is not necessarily conducive to it in some areas, but I think you need to make an honest effort to do that. And again, when you take the sum total of the recommendations, we think when you add them all up, it would be a significant change. But it's a change that you all have to do. It's not necessary. Mr. Hall can't implement these changes. You have to do it. He can give the impetus behind it, but you all have to do it, and it would be our intent that you do it. That closes my remarks. There's time for one question. Yes, sir.
Do any of your recommendations have possibility of objection by the Senate Intelligence Committees or the House Intelligence Committee?
That's a good question. One of the things that we're going to have to do, and we're aware of that, is I think the plan was to send the summary to the staffs. We've had Congressman Combest already request a briefing on the panel, and he did indicate to us when we went to brief him that he wanted to get the results of the panel in time for conference. So that is possible, but at this point I am not quite sure exactly what that would do. We're still a little early, and I need to make sure that you all understand that. Putting out a report that's essentially written by 10 or 15 people requires a lot of editing and a lot of aggregating and things like that. And it's taken us just a little bit longer to put together a final report. We hope to have a draft report done today. I call it a draft final. And I think it's only fair to let the Admiral take a look at it before we send it out. So we're hoping to get that draft out sometime today and have him and the panel members take a look at it, Mr. Hall and a couple of others. And then we hope to have it final as soon as possible, and then we'll publish it. Until then, it would be inappropriate for us to pass it up to the Hill. Sir.
Sir, did you address at all the relationship we have with NSA in this recommendation?
We did. It's in more detail in the customer's report. The chairman of the customer's panel was Dr. Fred Burko from the National Security Agency. And I would say that a sufficient amount of the proposal with respect to customers is based on the working group's relationship with the NRO, and I think probably the strongest part of that relationship, at least represented in that particular panel, a working group, was NSA. We did run into a problem. DIA was flapping on some world issues, and Admiral Jack D'Antona and his people were trying to stand up he was trying to run one organization and stand up another, so we did have not as much participation as we would have liked from those two organizations on the customer panel, but they did participate. Yes, ma'am.
Would you be providing copies of the 60-plus recommendations on the backbone so that some of us action officers can bubble up to the managers what we think of the binning of the responsibilities?
Once the Admiral's approved them, I see no reason why we can't. Is there any reason why we can't do that?
Sir, did the panel do an independent assessment or even an assessment to see if any of the recommendations conflicted with each other?
Oh, yes. Oh, yes. Extensive. Nauseating. We did, and where the working group could not resolve them, we kicked them up to the panel. Now, fortunately, in most cases, the working group was able to resolve them, but there were several several like that, there were conflicting recommendations, and we moved the contentious ones that we couldn't resolve to the panel, and frankly, the panel disposed with them fairly quickly.
Yes, sir. There was a discussion regarding our relationship with Dusty Space and the architectural. Was there any discussion regarding the relationship between us and Darrow in terms of their mission versus our mission and role?
Yes. As I said, that particular panel was a panel on new organizations, and we considered the Darrow a new organization. As I remember the report, what the report basically said is that the relationship with the Darrow is going well, as far as they were concerned. And they had no sea changes to recommend with respect to the relationship with the Darrow. There must be other questions. Bob. Mitch. Oh, okay. Sir?
The chart at the end of the briefing that showed how we would be postured in the 21st century, the attribute organization said that we would be matched to the customers, and I didn't see the correlation between that. Could you comment on that at all?
Yes. You need to have a more definitive, advertised, understood relationship with the customers. It needs to be decentralized, but the customers need to have a better understanding of exactly what the NRO does in the various areas. And in developing that, we would hope that it would match the customers a little stronger than perhaps some of them feel like it is now. NSA, for example, the comments out of NSA felt that they were dealing with many different customer organizations within the NRO and in the SIGINT area, not to mention OSO and others. It would be our intent to somehow develop a more structured understanding of exactly who NSA should be matched with and who they are, and other organizations. I thank you all for your time and attention. I would tell you, I would wrap it up with one thing. When I look at it, I say that the United States is where it is in the world because of three factors: its economic power, its military power, and its intelligence. And underpinning each of those three factors is are two items. One are its tremendous people and its technology. The NRO is the key element in intelligence that separates us from the rest of the world. Thanks for your time.